It was the most powerful flash ever created by man. A weapon so luminous it cast shadows on the moon. For 15 minutes, the sun had a rival in the Pacific sky. This is the story of Castle Bravo, the day we touched the fire of creation and learned we could not let it go. Welcome, dear visitor, to the Archive of Human Folly. I am your chief archivist, and tonight, by the flickering light of these ancient reading lamps, we turn to one of our most sobering exhibits. Here, in these climate-controlled vaults, we preserve the stories that time would rather forget, tales of grand ambitions that became cautionary legends. Tonight's case file bears the innocuous designation Castle Bravo, though the islanders of Rongelap knew it by another name, the sun that rose in the west. Before we begin this tragic odyssey, I invite you to join our community of fellow seekers. Subscribe to our archive, ring the notification bell, and help us preserve these essential human stories. For in understanding our past follies, we illuminate the path away from future ones. Now then, let us open the vault marked March 1st, 1954. The day humanity learned that there are some fires too bright to look upon, too hot to hold. The grand delusion. The mathematics of mutual destruction. To understand how we came to set the Pacific ablaze, we must first descend into the fevered logic of the early 1950s, a time when men in gray suits calculated the mathematics of mutual destruction, believing they could engineer safety through terror. Picture, if you will, the sterile corridors of the Pentagon in 1952. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead as officials huddle over classified reports bearing the crimson stamp of top secret. The Soviet Union has just detonated its first hydrogen bomb, a theoretical design they called layer cake. The American nuclear monopoly, brief and illusory as it was, has crumbled to atomic dust. In his diary, Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson would write, "We are no longer the only gods of this new fire. The question now is not whether we can destroy them, but whether we can destroy them faster." This was the grand delusion, the belief that salvation lay not in stepping back from the nuclear precipice, but in racing headlong toward it. The doctrine had a name, clinical and bloodless, mutually assured destruction. Its apostles spoke in the language of game theory and megadeaths, reducing human civilization to variables in an equation of annihilation. But we must peer deeper into this delusion, into the hearts of the men who believed they could tame Armageddon. For this was not mere madness, it was tragedy in its purest form. These were brilliant minds, patriots who genuinely believed they were safeguarding the future. Their fatal flaw was not evil, but hubris, the ancient Greek notion that mortals could challenge the gods and emerge unscathed. Consider the memoranda flowing between Washington and Los Alamos in the winter of 1953. President Eisenhower, the former general who had seen the true face of war, pens a note to his science advisor. "If we must live in a world of nuclear weapons, then by God, ours must be so terrible that no sane man would dare challenge us." The logic was seductive in its simplicity. If you could build a bomb so devastating, so apocalyptic in its power, that its very existence would prevent its use, then you had achieved not just military superiority, but a kind of negative peace. The bomb would become its own jailer, too dangerous to ever release. But what, exactly, would such a weapon look like? How do you measure the immeasurable? How do you quantify the unthinkable? The answer came in megatons units of destruction, measured against the power of 1,000,000 tons of TNT. The atomic bombs that leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 15 and 21 kilotons respectively. Terrible enough to end a war, but in the new calculus of deterrence, they seemed almost quaint. What the strategists envisioned was something incomparably more vast, a hydrogen bomb yielding not kilotons but megatons. A single weapon that could vaporize not just a city, but an entire region. A bomb so large that its creators would need to invent new words to describe its fury. In the classified briefing rooms of 1953, Generals and physicists sketched out scenarios with the detached precision of chess masters. They drew circles on maps, rings of total destruction, rings of severe damage, rings of radioactive fallout that would render vast areas uninhabitable for generations. But these were not just tactical calculations. They were acts of imagination so dark, so sweeping in their implications, that they bordered on the mythological. These men were not merely designing weapons. They were designing the end of the world, confident that their ability to destroy everything would ensure they would never have to. The delusion deepened with each passing month. Intelligence reports filtered in from Moscow. The Soviets were testing larger and larger weapons. Their scientists, led by the brilliant and tortured Andrei Sakharov, were rumored to be working on something called the a hydrogen bomb of theoretically unlimited power. And so the race was on. Not a race to some distant finish line, but a race to the bottom of human destructive capability. Each side convinced that their survival depended not on finding a way out of this mad sprint, but on being the first to reach the final terrible prize. A weapon so powerful, it would render all future weapons obsolete. The tragedy was already written in the stars. For the men pursuing this grand illusion had forgotten a fundamental truth about power, that to possess it is to be possessed by it. They believed they could build the ultimate weapon and then simply lock it away. But power once created has its own gravity, its own irresistible pull toward use. And so we arrive at the summer of 1953, when President Eisenhower signed the order that would set in motion the events of Castle Bravo. Operation Casella, series of nuclear tests designed to perfect America's hydrogen bomb capability. The goal was simple: build a bomb so large, so utterly devastating, that it would cow the Soviets into submission and bring about what one Pentagon planner called peace through superior firepower. What they did not yet understand, what none of them could yet imagine, was that they were about to unleash something beyond their control, beyond their calculations, beyond their most fearsome dreams. They thought they were touching the sun. They discovered they had become it. But before we witness the terrible flowering of their delusion, we must first meet the man whose obsession would fuel the fire, a brilliant physicist whose dreams of a super bomb would soon become the world's nightmare. Let us turn now to the second case file in our tragic tale. The Grand Obsession, the father of the super. In the hallowed halls of the University of Chicago, 1942, a young Hungarian physicist named Edward Teller paces before a blackboard covered in equations that seem to dance and writhe like living things. His colleagues call him brilliant, temperamental, obsessed. They have no idea that they are watching the birth of an apocalyptic vision. Teller's diary from this period reveals a mind consumed. The fission bomb is merely the primer, the match that lights a far greater fire. If we can harness the power that lights the stars themselves fusion, then we will hold in our hands the power of creation and destruction both. This was the beginning of the grand obsession, not merely the desire to build a bigger bomb, but the conviction that such a bomb was not just possible, but inevitable, and that if America did not build it first, someone else surely would. To understand Teller's obsession, we must first understand the man himself, a refugee from Hitler's Europe who had seen firsthand what happened when good men failed to prepare for evil. Born in Budapest in 1908, Teller had fled the gathering storm of fascism, carrying with him a profound belief that the only answer to evil was overwhelming power. In his unpublished memoirs, Teller would later write, "I escaped the first Holocaust by accident of birth and timing. I was determined that there should never be a second. If the price of peace was to become the master of ultimate destruction, then so be it. Better to be feared by tyrants than to be their victims." But there was something else driving Teller, something deeper than mere strategic calculation. In the quantum equations he scribbled late into the night, in the theoretical models he built of stellar nuclear fusion, Teller saw something that bordered on the divine. He was not just trying to build a weapon, he was trying to capture the very essence of cosmic power. The technical challenges were staggering. A fission bomb works by splitting heavy atoms, uranium or plutonium, releasing tremendous energy in the process. But fusion works by forcing light atoms' hydrogen isotopes to combine, mimicking the nuclear fires that burn at the heart of every star. The temperature required for fusion is almost incomprehensible. 100 million degrees Celsius, hot enough to vaporize any known material instantly. At such temperatures, matter itself ceases to exist as we understand it, becoming a plasma of pure energy. Teller's superbomb would need to create, if only for microseconds, conditions that existed nowhere in the universe except at the core of stars. Teller's colleagues at Los Alamos watched his obsession grow with a mixture of admiration and alarm. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, noted in a letter to his wife, "Edward speaks of the super as other men speak of a woman they love with longing, with desire, and with a kind of madness that I find both compelling and terrifying." But the obsession was not Teller's alone. As the Cold War deepened, as reports filtered back of Soviet nuclear advances, the super began to exert its own gravitational pull on American policy. Military leaders who had initially been skeptical found themselves drawn to the weapon's terrible promise. General Curtis LeMay, the architect of America's strategic bombing campaigns, wrote in his classified assessment, "If the Russians are working on a super bomb, then we need one twice as powerful. If they're not working on one, then we need to build ours so they never dare to start." The logic was circular, self-reinforcing, inescapable. The super bomb was necessary because it might be possible. It was possible because it was necessary. And Edward Teller stood at the center of this logical whirlpool, the prophet of a new kind of fire. Through the late 1940s and early 1950s, Teller labored in the atomic city of Los Alamos, surrounded by some of the brightest minds in physics. But the super remained theoretical, a beautiful and terrible dream sketched in equations and mathematical models. The breakthrough came in 1951 with a design concept that Teller and his colleague Stanislaw Ulam called radiation implosion. Instead of trying to compress and heat hydrogen fuel with conventional explosives, they would use the X-rays from a fission bomb to create an implosion so violent, so perfectly symmetrical, that it would squeeze hydrogen nuclei together with stellar-like force. Teller's journal entry from that day reads like the diary of a man possessed. Today, we have unlocked the secret. The super is no longer a dream. It is destiny. We have found the key to the stellar fire. God help us all. But even as the theoretical problems were solved, new challenges emerged. The super would require isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium, and tritium in quantities that pushed American production capabilities to their limits. It would require precision engineering beyond anything attempted before. And it would require a test site far from human civilization, for the weapon they were building would be too powerful to contain. And so the planners turned their attention to the Pacific, to a collection of coral atolls thousands of miles from anywhere, inhabited only by a few hundred Marshallese islanders, who still lived much as their ancestors had for 1,000 years. These remote specks of land, captured from the Japanese during World War II, seemed perfect for testing humanity's most powerful weapon. The Marshallese called their islands Majel, the place where the ocean meets the sky. Soon, they would witness something their ancient myths could never have imagined, the moment when heaven's fire came to earth. By early 1954, all the pieces were in place. The weapon design was finalized, a 3-stage thermonuclear device that would use a fission trigger to ignite a fusion fuel of liquid deuterium and tritium, which would in turn trigger a final fusion reaction in a uranium tamper. Theoretical yield: 6 megatons, 400 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Teller, now 46 years old and at the height of his influence, oversaw the final preparations with the intensity of a man who had spent a decade of his life pursuing a single, terrible vision. His letters to his wife, Maria, reveal a mind approaching the culmination of its greatest obsession. My dearest, the work nears completion. We are so close now to proving that the super can be built, can be controlled, can serve as the shield that protects our children and their children from the darkness of tyranny. I know you worry about me, about what we are doing here, but understand that we are not building a weapon, we are building tomorrow's peace. What Teller could not yet know, what none of them could imagine, was that their calculations contained a fatal flaw. The super they had built was not the 6-megaton weapon of their theoretical models. Due to an unexpected nuclear reaction in the uranium tamper, their controlled thermonuclear test would explode with nearly 3 times the predicted force. They had designed a monster, but they were about to birth a dragon. And dragons, as any student of mythology knows, cannot be tamed by their creators. They follow only their own terrible nature, burning everything in their path until they finally burn themselves out. And so we arrive at the morning of March 1st, 1954, the day when theoretical physics became apocalyptic reality, when a brilliant mind's obsession became the world's nightmare. Let us now turn to the third case file, where we witness the moment when humanity's reach so terribly exceeded its grasp. The fatal miscalculation, the dragon we could not tame. March 1st, 1954. Dawn breaks over Bikini Atoll like any other day in paradise. The lagoon shimmers turquoise under a pink-streaked sky. Palm fronds rustle in the trade winds. On the horizon, the support ships of Operation Castle bob peacefully at anchor, their crews preparing for what they believe will be a routine test of America's newest nuclear weapon. None of them suspect that in 3 hours, they will witness the birth of something beyond their understanding. A fire so bright it will be visible from space, so hot it will boil the ocean, so powerful it will crack the very foundations of the atomic age. In the final hour before detonation, let us pause to meet the souls who would be forever changed by what was about to unfold. Their stories, preserved in letters, diaries, and interviews, reveal the human faces behind history's most catastrophic miscalculation. Dr. John Clark, the radiological safety officer, writes in his final report before the test, "All calculations indicate a clean shot. Expected yield 6 megatons. Fallout pattern contained within the designated exclusion zone. Weather conditions optimal. We proceed with confidence in our preparations." What Dr. Clark could not know was that his calculations were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the weapon's design. The physicists had failed to account for the fact that fast neutrons from the fusion reaction would cause the uranium tamper to undergo massive fission, turning what should have been a 6-megaton test into a 15-megaton catastrophe. 90 miles away on Rongelap Atoll, a Marshallese fisherman named Almus Hermios tends to his nets as he has every morning for 30 years. His family sleeps peacefully in their traditional buoy, an open-sided house built from coconut palm and pandanus leaves. His children dream innocent dreams, unaware that they are about to become the unwilling subjects in the most horrific radiation experiment in human history. In his later testimony to Congress, Hermios would remember, "The morning was beautiful. My wife was preparing breakfast. Our youngest daughter was playing with her dolls made from coconut husks. We thought we lived in the safest place in the world, far from wars, far from the troubles of big countries. We did not know that the big countries had found us." At exactly 6:45 a.m. local time, the final countdown begins aboard the control ship USS Curtis, 23 miles from ground zero, what the planners believed to be a safe distance for a 6-megaton explosion. Military photographers adjust their cameras. Radiological monitors check their instruments one last time, and physicists make final notations in their logbooks. Edward Teller, watching from thousands of miles away at his laboratory in California, sees the seismic signature on his instruments at exactly 6:45 a.m. Pacific time. In his journal, he records the moment with almost mystical reverence. The needle jumps a seismic reading beyond our most optimistic projections. The super lives. The starfire burns. We have touched the face of creation itself. But Teller's triumph would soon turn to horror. For the seismic reading he celebrated was not the signature of success. It was the fingerprint of catastrophe. The device that was supposed to yield 6 megatons had exploded with a force of nearly 15 megatons, creating a fireball 4.5 miles wide and unleashing radioactive fury that would contaminate thousands of square miles of ocean. The flash, when it comes, defies description. Crewmen on ships 23 miles away are temporarily blinded even through their protective goggles. The fireball rises like a second sun, so bright that it casts shadows on clouds, so hot that it turns sand into glass and coral into radioactive powder. Photographer's mate Harold Agnew, stationed aboard the USS Curtis, would later write, "I have seen many sunrises, but this was not the sun. This was something else entirely, a light that seemed to come from beyond the edge of reality. For a moment, I thought the world was ending. For a moment, I was sure of it." The shock wave, when it arrives, is unlike anything the observers have experienced. It lifts the 45,000-ton Curtis partially out of the water. Windows shatter on ships 35 miles away. The mushroom cloud rises with impossible speed, punching through the stratosphere in minutes, ultimately reaching a height of 25 miles, so high that commercial airliners today would fly beneath its poisonous crown. But the true horror has only begun. As the minutes pass, as the impossible brightness fades to a malevolent glow, the wind begins to shift. The carefully calculated fallout pattern based on weather predictions for a 6-megaton device is now catastrophically wrong. Instead of dispersing safely over the empty ocean, the radioactive debris begins drifting toward inhabited islands. Rongelap Atoll, home to 64 Marshallese men, women, and children, lies directly in the path of what meteorologists would later call a death cloud, a massive plume of radioactive coral dust, fish scales, and vaporized seawater. Dr. Merrill Eisenbud, the Atomic Energy Commission's Health and Safety Director, receives the first wind reports at 8:30 a.m. His face goes white as he realizes what is happening. In his private notes, declassified decades later, he writes, "Wind shift confirmed. Fallout pattern now includes inhabited areas. We have a situation beyond our contingency planning. God help those people." At approximately 10:30 a.m., 4 hours after the detonation, the radioactive snow begins to fall on Rongelap. The Marshallese, who have no word in their language for radioactivity, watch with curiosity as white ash drifts down like strange snow. Children play in it. Adults taste it, finding it salty and slightly bitter. Lemio Aban, an elder who survived that day, would later testify. The ash fell like snow, but it was not cold like snow. It was warm, and it stuck to everything: our hair, our clothes, our food. The children were happy because they had never seen snow before. We did not know it was death falling from the sky. By noon, radiation levels on Rongelap reach 175 roentgens per hour, lethal dose that would kill half of those exposed in just 2 hours. The islanders, following their traditional practices, continue their daily activities. They eat fish caught in the contaminated lagoon. They drink rainwater that has washed radioactive particles from their roof thatch. They sleep under pandanus leaves coated with plutonium dust. Meanwhile, 23 miles from Ground Zero, the crew of the Japanese fishing vessel Dago Fukuri Maru, known to the world as Lucky Dragon No. 5, is hauling in their nets, unaware that they have been fishing in what is now the most radioactive body of water on Earth. Aikichi Kuboyama, the boat's radio operator, notices the strange ash covering their deck, but thinks little of it. In his final diary entry, translated years later, he writes, "Strange weather today. Ash falling from clear skies. The fish are biting well, though they seem sluggish, and some have an odd coloration. We head for home with a good catch. What Kuboyama could not know was that the good catch in their hold was so radioactive it would eventually kill him and sicken his 22 crewmates. The Daiju Fukurimaru had become a floating tomb, carrying its cargo of death toward the unsuspecting markets of Japan. As the hours pass, the magnitude of the disaster becomes clear to the test planners. Radiation monitors aboard the control ships are clicking so rapidly they sound like machine guns. Aircraft sent to measure the fallout pattern return with readings that shatter all previous scales. Admiral William Blandy, the operation commander, sends an urgent, classified message to Washington. Castle Bravo exceeded all predictions. Significant contamination of inhabited areas confirmed. Require immediate evacuation protocols and medical support. This is beyond our contingency planning. But evacuation is not immediate. Through a tragic confluence of miscommunication, bureaucratic delay, and sheer disbelief at the scale of the disaster, the people of Rongelap are left in their radioactive hell for 2 full days, while those on more distant atolls, like Utrecht, wait even longer, some up to 3 days. Days of breathing poisoned air, drinking contaminated water, eating irradiated food. Dr. Robert Conard, the military physician eventually sent to evacuate the islanders, would later describe the scene that greeted him. He found a population in the early stages of acute radiation sickness, hair falling out in clumps, skin lesions, nausea and vomiting. The children were the worst. Their bodies simply couldn't process the massive radiation doses they had absorbed. We had turned paradise into a medical emergency. The evacuation, when it finally comes, is swift but far too late. The 64 residents of Rongelap, along with inhabitants of other affected atolls, including Elingyinai and Utrecht, are airlifted to American military hospitals, where they become unwilling subjects in the largest human radiation experiment in history. They are studied, tested, and monitored, but many are never truly. The mythic echo. When fire became legend in the traditional stories of the Marshall Islands, there was once a great fire demon called Itao who lived beneath the waves. When angered, Itao would rise from the depths, bringing with him flames that could boil the ocean and poison the fish for generations. The elders said this was just mythology until the morning of March 1st, 1954, when myth became reality, and reality became more terrible than any myth. But the echoes of Castle Bravo would spread far beyond the Pacific, entering the realm of popular culture in ways both profound and strange. For humanity had unleashed something that demanded not just scientific understanding, but mythological interpretation. We had created our own dragon, and like all dragons in human stories, it could not be slain, only lived with, feared, and remembered. The first echo came, ironically, from Japan, the nation whose fishing vessel Dago Fukurimaru had sailed unknowingly into nuclear hell. In the Toho Film Studios of Tokyo, 1954, a young director named Ishiro Honda was struggling with a project about a giant monster emerging from the Pacific depths. Honda's original concept was simple enough: a creature awakened by nuclear testing, a beast that embodied Japan's atomic trauma. But as reports filtered in about the Dago Fukurimaru, about radioactive tuna flooding Japanese markets, about an American hydrogen bomb that had poisoned vast areas of the Pacific, Honda realized his monster needed to be something more than entertainment. In his director's notes, Honda wrote, "This creature cannot be merely frightening, it must be tragic. It must embody the horror of what we have awakened in the depths of the atom. When audiences see our monster, they must think not of fantasy, but of Castle Bravo." And so Gojira was born, a creature whose very name combined gorilla and Kujira, whale, but whose essence was pure radioactive fire. When the film premiered in Tokyo in November 1954, just 8 months after Castle Bravo, audiences saw not a simple monster movie, but a meditation on nuclear horror. The creature's radioactive breath, its impervious hide scarred by atomic fire, its emergence from hydrogen bomb testing grounds, every aspect of Gojira reflected the lingering trauma of Castle Bravo. In the film's most powerful scene, a paleontologist explains the monster's origin. The hydrogen bomb awakened Gojira from its ancient slumber, and now it brings with it the curse of radioactivity. A curse that will persist long after the monster itself is gone. But the mythic echo of Castle Bravo resonated in American culture as well, though often in more subtle ways. The 1950s boom in science fiction films then. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, Tarantula reflected a deep cultural anxiety about radiation and atomic testing. These were not merely entertainments, but attempts to process a trauma too large for direct confrontation. Dr. Susan Sontag, in her influential essay, The Imagination of Disaster, would later write, "The science fiction films of the 1950s were not about the future, they were about Castle Bravo. Every mutant creature, every radioactive monster, every tale of atomic-powered catastrophe was our culture's attempt to understand what we had unleashed in the Pacific." The echo grew more complex as the years passed. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, her groundbreaking work on environmental destruction. Though focused on chemical pesticides, Carson's book was deeply influenced by the Castle Bravo fallout studies, particularly their revelation that radioactive contamination could travel through food chains in unexpected ways. Carson wrote, "Castle Bravo taught us that we can no longer pretend our actions have only local consequences. The radioactive particles that fell on Rongelap also fell, in smaller doses, on rainforests in South America, on farms in Iowa, on children's playgrounds in suburban neighborhoods thousands of miles from the test site. We have learned that the Earth is not vast enough to contain our most powerful mistakes." Perhaps the most haunting echo came in the form of a simple children's song that emerged in the late 1950s. Children on playgrounds across America began singing a rhyme whose origins number adult could trace. Flash in the morning, snow from the sky, fish in the ocean starting to die. Count to 10, and then count some more. Nobody knows what the counting is for. Child psychologists studying the phenomenon were disturbed to discover that children who sang the song often drew pictures of bright flashes and falling ash, despite having no direct knowledge of nuclear testing. The myth of Castle Bravo had entered the collective unconscious, transmitted through channels beyond rational understanding. The political echo was equally profound. Castle Bravo marked the beginning of the end for atmospheric nuclear testing. The international outcry over radioactive fish, poisoned islanders, and fallout that had drifted far beyond any predicted boundaries forced world leaders to confront the reality that nuclear weapons could not be contained by national borders or military calculations. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy would sign the Partial Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting atmospheric nuclear testing. In his speech announcing the treaty, Kennedy made explicit reference to Castle Bravo. "We have learned that the fire we thought we could control recognizes no boundaries. The radioactive ash that fell on Pacific Islanders could just as easily fall on American children, on Soviet citizens, on the innocent of every nation. We must move our testing underground, away from the air we all breathe, the water we all drink." But perhaps the most significant echo was scientific. The long-term health studies of the Marshallese exposed to Castle Bravo fallout became the foundation for our modern understanding of radiation's effects on human health. Dr. Robert Conard's meticulous documentation of thyroid cancers, earth defects, and genetic damage provided the first comprehensive picture of how radiation moves through human populations across generations. In his final report, published in 1982, Dr. Conard wrote, "The people of Rongelap have taught us more about radiation biology than all our laboratory experiments combined. Their suffering has become our knowledge. Their tragedy has become our textbook. We owe them not just medical care, but the promise that we will never again conduct such experiments, intended or otherwise, on human populations. The Marshallese themselves became living repositories of the Castle Bravo myth. Children born after 1954 grew up with stories of the zhuzhaj that fell from the sky, of the fish that glowed in the dark, of the strange cancers that appeared in their families years later. Laijan Eknalang, who survived the fallout as a child, became an activist and storyteller, preserving the oral history of that terrible day. In her testimony before the World Court in 1995, she said, "We have become the keepers of a story the world would rather forget. But we cannot forget, because we carry the memory in our bodies, in our children, in our children's children. Castle Bravo is not history for us. It is still happening." Even the natural world carries echoes of that March morning. The coral reefs around Bikini Atoll, slowly recovering after decades of radioactive contamination, show genetic mutations that marine biologists are still studying. Fish species that were exposed to fallout display unusual patterns of coloration and behavior that persist across generations. Dr. William Fennicle, a marine chemist who has studied Bikini's recovery, notes, "Nature remembers Castle Bravo in ways we're only beginning to understand. The creatures living in these waters carry molecular scars from that day, not just in their bodies, but encoded in their DNA. The explosion lasted microseconds, but its echo will persist in the marine ecosystem for centuries." The myth of Castle Bravo continued to evolve through the decades. In the 1980s, anti-nuclear activists adopted the image of radioactive snow falling on children as a symbol of nuclear weapons' indiscriminate nature. The phrase radioactive snow appeared in protest songs, peace movement literature, and political speeches. Singer-songwriter Jackson Browne's 1982 song, For America, included the haunting line. They said the snow was safe to touch. The children played until they learned too much. The song never mentions Castle Bravo by name, but its imagery draws directly from the testimonies of Rongelap survivors. Today, nearly 70 years after Castle Bravo, the test's mythic echo continues to reverberate. The Marshallese diaspora scattered across the Pacific and beyond by rising sea levels and lingering. Contamination carries the story to new shores. In churches in Arkansas, in community centers in Hawaii, in college classrooms across America, Marshallese grandparents tell their grandchildren about the day the sun rose in the west. Kathy Jetnil Kiesiner, a Marshallese poet and climate activist, writes, "We are the children of Castle Bravo, the grandchildren of the atomic age. We carry in our bodies the memory of fire, the knowledge of what happens when power is unleashed without wisdom. Our story is a warning written in flesh and bone." But the myth has taken on new dimensions in our current age of climate change and global environmental crisis. Castle Bravo has become a metaphor for humanity's recurring tendency to unleash forces beyond our understanding or control. Climate scientists studying global warming often reference Castle Bravo as a cautionary tale about unintended consequences. Dr. James Hansen, the NASA climatologist who first warned of global warming, wrote, "Castle Bravo taught us that our atmosphere is smaller and more fragile than we imagined. The radioactive particles that circled the globe in days showed us how quickly human actions can have planetary consequences. We ignored that lesson at our peril." And so the mythic echo of Castle Bravo continues to spread, carried not by radioactive particles, but by human memory, human storytelling, human conscience. What began as a miscalculation in nuclear physics has become a fundamental myth of the atomic age, a story that warns us about the dangers of touching forces beyond our comprehension. The Pacific waters around Bikini Atoll are clear again. The fish populations are recovering. The coral reefs show signs of renewal. But the story remains, preserved in human memory like radioactive isotopes with infinite half-lives. For Castle Bravo taught us something that no amount of scientific calculation could predict. that our most powerful creations inevitably escape our control, taking on lives of their own in the realm of myth and memory. We thought we were building a weapon. Instead, we built a legend one that continues to shape how we understand power, responsibility, and the unintended consequences of human ambition. The myth of Castle Bravo reminds us that some fires, once lit, can never be extinguished. They burn on in the human imagination, casting shadows on every generation that follows, warning us about the terrible beauty and ultimate tragedy of touching the sun. Reflection. And so we come to the end of this tragic tale, dear visitor. The story of Castle Bravo, like all the exhibits in our Archive of Human Folly, is not merely a historical curiosity, but a mirror reflecting the eternal human struggle between ambition and wisdom, between the desire to transcend our limitations and the humility to accept them. Edward Teller and his colleagues were not evil men. They were brilliant minds pursuing what they genuinely believed was a noble goal, the prevention of war through the ultimate expression of power. Their fatal flaw was not malice, but hubris, the ancient Greek belief that mortals could challenge the gods and emerge unscathed. They sought to build a weapon so terrible that it would end the possibility of war itself. Instead, they created something that transcended their understanding, their control, their most fearsome calculations. They thought they were touching the sun. They discovered they had become it and learned too late that solar fire burns everything it touches. The Marshallese islanders who suffered in Castle Bravo's radioactive snow, the Japanese fishermen who sailed unknowingly into nuclear hell, the countless others whose lives were changed by that March morning. They remind us that our grandest ambitions always exact a human cost, often paid by those who had no voice in our decisions. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Castle Bravo is how it continues to echo through time, transforming from historical event into cultural myth, from political disaster into spiritual warning. In Godzilla's radioactive roar, in children's playground rhymes, in the genetic memory of Pacific coral reefs, Castle Bravo persists a reminder that some actions resonate across generations, their consequences rippling outward like radioactive particles on the wind. The men who built the super believed they could engineer safety through terror, peace through the threat of ultimate destruction. What they discovered was that ultimate power is ultimately beyond human wisdom to wield. They wanted to become the masters of apocalypse. Instead, they became its servants. Tonight, as you leave this archive and return to your own world, carry with you the lesson of Castle Bravo, that courage and folly can often look the same, that our noblest intentions can yield our most tragic outcomes, that the fire of human ambition, however bright, casts shadows that can darken generations. The physicists of 1954 went searching for the ultimate weapon. Instead, they found the ultimate cautionary tale, a story that reminds us that some knowledge